All right, everyone. Welcome to our presentation entitled Forecasting Strategies for Inclusion in the Future of Work. My name is REV and I'm a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. And I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. My co-presenters include Kay Nasir and Ali Shameh from the Institute for Work and Health, and also Aisha Zubair, who works at RBC Royal Bank of Canada. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging this land on which the Institute for Work and Health operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. So over the last 3 years, our team at the Institute for Work and Health has been examining different aspects of the future of work and their impact on people living with disabilities, as well as other vulnerable workers. And so we're going to be providing a presentation on the program of research that our team has been engaged in over the last few years. I just want to start by acknowledging our funders, including the New Frontiers and Research Fund, as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which are both federal research funding bodies. I'd also like to acknowledge Accessibility Standards Canada. Our team that's been participating in this research is multidisciplinary and diverse and includes academics from across Canada as well as internationally. Also, I wanted to really give a really big shout out to our community partners that have played a significant role in our research and all phases of the research. So we'd just like to show our appreciation for the diverse group of community partners who are involved. So in today's presentation, there are 3 kind of micro presentations followed by an interactive discussion with our industry representative. The first presentation will focus on defining the future of work, as well as highlighting its challenges and opportunities for people living with disabilities. In our second presentation, we'll examine how decision makers view the future of work through a study of policy leaders. And third, we're going to describe a process in which we are engaged in, where we're trying to generate strategies for inclusion in the future of work. And then that'll then be followed by the Q&A. So in the following slides, I'm going to present some findings from 2 studies. The first is a synthesis of evidence. The second is a qualitative study of young people living with disabilities. And so due to time constraints, I'm not going to dive into the specific methods, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on how we collect the data, either towards the end of this presentation, or you're welcome to email me offline. Let's start by defining the future of work. We define the future of work as the large scale and rapid digitization and automation of diverse domains of working life. But it's important to highlight that the future of work is not just about technology. It includes changes caused by social, demographic, political, as well as environmental factors. And what's important here is that the future of work reflects a dramatic change to every industry and the transformation to all aspects of our working life, including how we work, where we work, and with whom we work. And what's interesting to note is that the future of work is superimposed on top of ongoing industrial shifts, like the move from agricultural to knowledge-based industries, the offshoring of work, as well as the growth in non-standard work arrangements like gig work. And what we've learned from our research is that it can be really challenging to plan and think in terms of future. So thinking about the future of work can be challenging for many. And so when talking to young people living with disabilities, we found that there was a general hesitation for participants to think about their working life too far into the future. Many participants that we talked to described being more concerned about how the unpredictability of a disability or the inaccessibility of a work environment could create conditions in their present working situation. For instance, one person noted, "It's difficult for me to think about the future because I used to make plans and then life would go in very unexpected ways. So I just stopped." And so while we certainly acknowledge the importance of addressing barriers to employment inclusion in the present, it's also necessary to focus on potential changes that could emerge in the future and develop responsive policies and programs. One critical reason to study the future of work is that new occupations are being created. In a recent study, Economists at MIT conducted an analysis of occupational titles that existed in the 1940s and then compared them to occupations that existed in 2018. What they found was that 60% of occupations held by employees in 2018 did not exist in the 1940s. These are brand new occupations with evolving working conditions. The authors of this study highlight the emergence of technology-related occupations like information technology specialists or biomedical engineers, but they also talk about the growth in in-person service jobs like mental health counselors, sommeliers, or fitness coaches. And these represent another category of occupations that emerged during that period of time. So indeed, technology has played a significant part in the emergence of new technologies and new occupations. But the authors also point to increased globalization, which has resulted in a decline in jobs in agriculture and manufacturing settings. Also, a rise in wages has meant that people have more money to spend in the service-based economy. So based on these powerful findings, we can ask ourselves several key questions. The first is, what new jobs will be created in the next 2 decades? The second is, how will working conditions within these new jobs create barriers or facilitators to employment for people living with disabilities? And finally, what steps can we take in the present to address barriers to inclusion that may emerge in the future? So to begin answering some of these questions, we recently conducted a comprehensive horizon scan of gray and peer-reviewed research, as well as social media, to examine aspects of the future of work that could emerge and contribute to adversity for different groups of workers. And our team identified 9 key macro trends from technological, social, political, as well as environmental domains that characterize the future of work. Examples of trends included the digital transformation of the economy, the growing application of artificial intelligence to automate work, as well as climate change and the green economy. Of note, our study highlighted that these trends were interrelated and could individually, as well as collectively, contribute to vulnerability in the future of work. This horizon scan provides a roadmap to understand how the future of work could create conditions that pose challenges for people living with disabilities. This scan also identifies where strategies can be implemented within workplaces and policy settings so that they're resilient to changes in the future. Given the time constraints of this talk, I'm going to briefly touch on a few themes that emerge more specifically in this research. In discussions on the future of work, it's clear to see that technology will shape employment conditions. And so a lot of attention has been directed towards the digital transformation of the economy as a significant driver of change. We often hear about the Internet of Things, smart sensors, cloud computing, virtual reality, 3D printing, robotics, as well as blockchain technology. There's also been an increasing discussion on artificial intelligence and machine learning, with workplaces deploying computerized systems to replicate human intelligence and behaviors. And while these are all diverse technologies, they're resulting in a hyperconnectivity between people, businesses, digital devices, and data. They're also rapidly changing the way jobs are performed and the requirement for humans to work alongside machines, which definitely have implications for people living with disabilities. Another key aspect of our research and a key finding was that the impact of technology can be fragmented. First, technology can create challenges for people living with disabilities. For example, the advancement of digital platforms has facilitated gig work, which could be more precarious and stressful. Also, growing applications of AI could lead to the automation of work, where repetitive job tasks will continue to be replaced by machines. We can think about the self-checkout counter replacing cashier jobs. But over time, as certain technology advances, it's expected that more complex and predictive job tasks may be automated. As a result, there may be more competition for both entry-level as well as professional types of jobs. Also, there's a risk that only available entry-level jobs will be those that pay less, have unpredictable physical demands, and could be more unsafe, as well as those that could exacerbate disability. It's thought that these types of jobs may be more challenging to automate. As a result, they'll continue to grow over time. And we could think about a nursing aide in a long-term care setting. That's a job that's definitely variable, definitely physical, and definitely unsafe. At the same time, technology could also be associated with opportunities for people living with disabilities. Obviously, the advancement of different technology will contribute to productivity gains and the development of new occupations, which I mentioned earlier. Different technologies could also be leveraged to create conditions that are more accessible. We can think about a smart robot in a manufacturing setting, which could enable a person to take on more cognitive demands while relying on a robot for physical support. Digital technology can also provide a level of flexibility that could be beneficial for people with disabilities. Also, while gig work can be seen in a negative light for some workers, it could provide an entry point into the labor market. Furthermore, in a digitized world, workers with emotional intelligence, which cannot be replaced by a computer at this time, could be in high demand by employers. This could be beneficial for workers from diverse groups who may have different lived experience. Interestingly, when talking to people living with disabilities, we found that those with more secure employment and those in white-collar jobs were more likely to believe that technology would have a positive impact on their employment. For example, one participant who worked full-time described the benefits of digital technologies in enabling them to work from home and to improve accessibility. They noted, if there's more advances in technology where people can have the same software they're using at work and being able to use that at home, I think it will give, especially for people with disabilities, more opportunities to be able to have a job and keep a job. Like with our company right now, they're looking at options for cloud software for us, for our computers. And I think facilitating work at home, maybe access to other spaces that wouldn't normally be accessible to people otherwise. On the other hand, participants in our research who were employed precariously felt that advancements in the development and application of different digital technologies within their workplaces would negatively impact their employment over time. For example, one participant working precariously in the service industry described the negative impact that digital transformation of the economy would have to their employment. They noted, I don't think technology would be a good thing in my job because customers could interface with a computer screen and it tells them everything they want to know. What use are us to be there? We're dispensing information. The more technologically advanced things get, it's less likely they'll need us. It's important to highlight that the future of work is not just shaped by technology, a theme that I want to continue to reinforce. In our horizon scan, we've found that climate change, globalization, populist sentiments are also expected to change the nature and availability of work. Similarly, external shocks like a recession, natural disaster, or as we have seen this pandemic, has the potential to disrupt employment and drastically change working conditions. Consistent across these trends, we found that it's the most vulnerable groups of workers who will be the first to be affected and more likely to face adverse working conditions resulting from these trends. We certainly need additional research to understand how different aspects of the future of work could create barriers to employment inclusion for people living with disabilities and design policies and programs that could be resilient to these changes. And so with that being said, I'd like to now introduce my colleague, Ali Shambi, who will describe a study where he talked to decision makers about their views regarding the future of work for people living with disabilities. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Arif. So in my presentation, I will discuss some of the findings of the key informants interviews about the future work as it relates to people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Based on what Arif presented, obviously, there are some inequities in the future work, and we wanted to elicit key informants' insights about the future work as it relates to people with disabilities. By key informants, we mean policymakers, future work experts, labor market specialists, and disability experts. So in the interviews, we asked them about their opinion regarding the study findings that Arif touched on. As a reminder, in that study, we identified 9 major trends that have the potential to shape or change the future work from disability and health perspectives. In the interviews, we asked participants to reflect on the future work as a whole and the impact of the identified trends on the world of work for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. As these charts show, we talked to people with diverse expertise from different provinces as well as the federal government. Next slide, please. So in our conversations, we heard a lot of information regarding current workplace, community level, and policy level barriers to employment. Although in earlier phase of the project, we found that young people with disabilities struggle to think about the future, it was different in our interviews with key informants. For instance, disability experts and employment service providers mostly reflected on existing labor market problems, while policymakers talked about higher-level policies that needed to be implemented to tackle those issues. However, future work experts address the potential future barriers to or opportunities in the future work from a broader point of view. As a result, we gained a decent combination of insights regarding the impact of identified trends on the labor market in the future and how to tackle the problems and benefit from the opportunities. I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation highlighting some of the key findings of this study. Notably, we are still at the preliminary phases of the study and will publish articles of the final analysis in peer-reviewed journals. Next slide, please. So one of the most consistently described themes through the participants' interviews was the inclusion in the digitized future work. So based on our data, we define inclusion as the intersection between the meaningful involvement of people with disabilities in all aspects of working life and the changing nature of work, especially related to the advancement of digital technologies, as well as other social, economic, environmental, and political changes. Next slide, please. Our participants noted a bunch of concerns about digital equity. We address this overarching topic with a more familiar theme that defies digital equity, which is the digital divide. The digital divide in our study refers to the inequities in access or understanding the use of digital technologies. We identified three major factors that could result in the digital divide. In other words, gaps in other socioeconomic areas result in digital divide in the future work, especially for people living with a disability. Of note, these three main factors are interrelated and impact each other directly or indirectly. In the next few slides, I'll present what each divide means and provide some examples of our discussions with participants. Next slide, please. The first factor perpetuating the digital divide and noted by most of the participants is the importance of having access to broadband connection and access to digital technologies. Access to connectivity and the internet, as an example, has been discussed as a human right and nowadays is being considered as an essential infrastructure, just like electricity or roads. Our participants noted the affordability of internet and digital technologies in Canada, which is one of the most expensive countries when it comes to the internet. People with disabilities, on average, are on the lower levels of income and affordability of tech and the internet. It significantly impacts their employment and career in the future work. So the access divide can affect people participating in the digital world, getting proper education or skills training, finding or sustaining employment, or advancing their career. Next slide, please. Provincial policymakers in an Atlantic province reflected on the role of the digital divide in excluding people with disabilities in rural areas from digital work environments and reinforcing inequities. One policymaker in a focus group style interview noted, "So there needs to be that additional perspective put on the idea of the future, on the picture of the future, that there really is such a thing as a digital divide. It does actually exist here in Canada, in remote and northern communities and poor parts of big cities. So I think that the wealth disparities, all of those normal parts of the human socioeconomic condition, globally continue to be a mitigating factor to the realization of those golden dreams of an AI future." Next slide, please. The second main factor causing the digital divide was access to education or skills training. Our participants suggested that digital literacy, along with other soft skills, are essential in the future work for all workers, especially people with disabilities. People with lower levels of skills or education are more likely to be negatively impacted in the future of work. In the discussions on skills training, some knowledge experts noted the emergence of micro-credentials and how they might replace formal education in the future work. Other key informants expressed the need to revamp the education system to be more inclusive and up-to-date to the needs of workers and to the industry demands of the future work. Next slide, please. Regarding the skills divide and the future work, one of the future work experts noted I do think people with disabilities are uniquely disadvantaged as a particular vulnerable group and will be disproportionately impacted by these kinds of labor force developments that basically further drive the wedge in the labor market. The divide between highly skilled and what has historically been semi-skilled or low-skilled employment, but still offered a decent wage and benefits and so forth. Next slide, please. The third force perpetuating the digital divide is the resource divide. Our study suggests that people with disabilities are more impacted by income insecurity and work precarity. This will force them to work more than one job to secure their livelihood. This alone hammers the wedge deeper in the digital divide, as they don't have enough money or time to access proper technologies or educate themselves for career advancement. Key informants discussed several policies regarding social safety nets, guaranteed income, or flexible work settings to provide more resources for people with disabilities in the future of work. Next slide, please. Another future work expert on the resource divide noted, I really do think striking a balance. I just don't think it's an either or. I mean, I'm a big believer, as you can tell, in boosting minimum wage. You've got to push things up from the bottom because you're always going to catch the mid people. It's just a game. People will fall through the cracks and there are fewer people that will fall. That's why we have to pay so much attention to the quality of the social safety net and the quality of our healthcare system to do that. Next slide, please. So based on our conversation with the participants as presented, we identified 3 major forces that could perpetuate the digital divide in the future work. However, we also heard about other factors impacting the digital divide. These factors are cross-cutting ones that impact one or more areas we discussed earlier. So they could either widen or minimize the digital divide. For instance, key informants talked about the demographic gaps and how the new generations have different values and mindsets than older generations. Although they might have higher digital literacy compared to their older counterparts, they still suffer from access divide and resource divide, especially within people with disabilities. Also, the gap between secure employment and increasing gig work perpetuates the digital divide and income divide. People in precarious employment thought that this digital gap is felt much greater when they are in the gig economy, as they have limited access to skills training or access to high-speed internet or digital devices. Another example is the lack of access to internet in some rural or remote areas, which results in a deeper divide and migration of young workers to urban areas. So as we move forward with this study, we'll continue to explore some of these themes with greater depth. By this note, I conclude my presentation, and I think it's a good segue to handing it over to Kay to talk about the study that seeks to find some strategies and programs in the future work for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Ellen. So I'll be talking to you today about research that our team has been conducting for just over a year now to find potential solutions for some of the challenges that were discussed today by my colleagues that are predicted to emerge in the future of work. Specifically, we're looking to predict the supports that may be needed at the early career stage in the future that will also potentially address the different trends. To achieve this, we use what's known as the Delphi method, which I'll talk about in brief in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So we have 3 overarching objectives for this project that have shaped our study design. The first is to build consensus or agreement around the different solutions that will address employment challenges in the future of work. We try to understand how these solutions can be implemented in different contexts, including workplaces, in community programs, and through policy changes. The second objective is to determine the barriers in accessing or implementing these solutions. And the third objective is to make future-oriented program and policy recommendations that will promote inclusion in the future of work. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we use a Delphi survey as a core component for our data collection in order to achieve our study objectives. The Delphi method is a foresight-based research approach that draws on expert opinions through multiple stages of questionnaires to make recommendations about the future. It's a more time-intensive approach to collect data compared to a regular survey, but it allows us to gather more detailed and contextualized responses from a diverse group of people. A key strength of using the Delphi survey is that it gives participants the opportunity to reflect and adjust their own responses in each questionnaire round by comparing their recommendations to other participants. This way, we're able to achieve a greater level of agreement around the final solutions that are produced among a diverse group of people. So for our project, we administer 2 rounds of the Delphi survey in an online platform over a period of 6 months in both English and French. In the first round, we ask our participants to design strategies to support the early career stage in the future, and we follow that up in 6 months with a summary that we provide to all participants about the findings from the first round, and we ask them to rank the solutions that were suggested in order of their usefulness and importance for young people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So from May to October of this year, we conducted the first round of the Delphi survey across Canada. We surveyed young people who have lived experience with disability and a second group of key informants, which included policymakers, employment service providers, and labor market experts. A total of 125 participants completed the survey, which included 77 key informants and 48 young people with disabilities. 94 participants agreed to take part in the second Delphi survey, which we'll be conducting next year. An important point regarding our study is that we adopt an integrated knowledge transfer and exchange approach, which means that different knowledge users and experts were engaged in the research process. Before we collected data, we pilot tested the survey with our partners in the disability community and our advisory panel of young people with lived experience to ensure that the survey was accessible to participants, for example, with the language that was used, the kinds of questions that we asked, and compatibility with assistive technologies such as screen readers. Next slide, please. So for us to generate a broad set of strategies for inclusion in the future of work that were recommended by our panel, we structured our questions so that each person was asked about a random selection of emerging trends across the technological, social-political, and environmental domains. We asked participants to talk about the potential impacts of the different trends on employment experiences in the future of work. Next slide, please. We also asked them to describe up to 4 policies, programs, or supports that could directly address that trend. We provided the space for people to describe their responses at length so we can get greater insights into the solutions that were suggested. Next slide, please. Currently, our team is in the preliminary stage of analyzing the findings from the first round of the survey that was conducted this year. We've noted some key policy and program recommendations that were made to support the employment experiences of people with disabilities and provide solutions for emerging trends in the future of work. So for instance, to address skill training needs in the future, participants recommended training for soft skills and increased opportunities for remote learning. In another example, participants talked about the need for employers to be prepared and proactive to address external shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic that may affect future labor markets. Next slide, please. Other recommendations made by many participants included protections from excessive digital surveillance and supports to afford advanced digital tools to prepare for the digital transformation of the economy. When discussing the use of artificial intelligence or AI in HR systems, participants recommended that both humans and AI systems be involved in HR decisions, and also recommended the importance of workplace transparency in using AI for HR decisions affecting employees. Next slide, please. So our open-ended questions allowed participants to share their insights about the complex nature of the future of work and the challenges and opportunities that it might present. For instance, when talking about the impact of digital technologies in the future of work, one participant with lived experience shared, despite the fact that advances in digital technology might lead to more accessible digital interfaces and more efficient ways of completing tasks, I am concerned about the ways surveillance practices and policing practices might become normalized in workspaces. The ability to work from home throughout the pandemic has undoubtedly accommodated my disability for the better, but hyperconnectivity itself can be a difficult trigger for neurodivergent people to manage. So while these findings are preliminary, as we move forward with our analysis, we hope to provide a comprehensive set of policy and program recommendations that were made by our participants to make the future of work more inclusive. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Arif.
Thank you so much, Kay. That was wonderful. And thank you, Ellie. Before we move to the second kind of segment of this panel, I just wanted to just put our information up on the screen for everyone. If you have any questions about the research that we can't answer in today's session, feel free to utilize my email address or contact us over Twitter. We'd be happy to expand on some of the research that we're doing and describe the methods in greater depth. Also, if you're interested in participating in any of these initiatives or you have ideas that you think could be interesting to pursue, we're always open to pursuing new innovative research, and we love to engage with individuals in the community. So feel free to reach out. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to ask Aisha to turn on her camera, which she has done. So thanks, Aisha. And I know there were several questions in the chat, and I will get to those, or our team will get to those. But first, I'd like to introduce Aisha, Aisha Zubair, who will provide an applied industry perspective to the discussion that we've had in this panel. So just as a very brief introduction, Aisha is a senior product manager in the enterprise learning strategy and in innovation at RBC Royal Bank. In addition to her expertise in diversity and inclusion, Aisha has been an active advisory panel member in our future of work research, and she's provided significant contributions to a lot of the work that we do. And so we're really thrilled that Aisha is going to be joining us today and maybe provide us with some reflections on her thoughts with regards to inclusion in the future of work. So Aisha, welcome, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like you maybe to start by describing your role and your work within RBC.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm so pleased to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity. It's wonderful to join sort of this group of super passionate and like-minded individuals. Always a pleasure to be here. So for me, you've given a little bit of an introduction. So my role is really about three portfolios, right? So it's about within learning strategies for the enterprise. My role is about looking at climate learning. So how do we build the skills that we need as an organization around climate and climate change, around future and hybrid work. So we know that the future of work and hybrid work. So we know that there are certain skills that are going to help us succeed in the future. And so that's another area that I'm responsible for, and just communication skills, right? Because those are changing as well. The more digital communication methods we have, how do we manage all of that? So, I think that ties in very well with some of the themes we've been talking about.
So indeed, within your work and within your scope of practice, there's a lot of like innovative research being going on, not just related to technology, but also related to climate. Yeah. In those discussions, and maybe you can talk about your role specifically, or maybe you could think more broadly, but sure. What role does inclusion play in those discussions? Is an inclusive lens considered when people are thinking about how to adjust to changes in the future of work, especially on the industry side?
Well, I mean, like, I can only speak to my experience, and I would say that, like, D&I is just sort of how we do work, right? So it's just how we work, and it's embedded into all of the discussions that we have. So when we talk about learning, we're also talking about how do we create learning that is accessible, that is barrier free, that is, we're thinking about rural actually as well, like city versus rural, like how do we enable learning that might be not as easy to access. So how do we enable all of that? And then I think there comes another layer. It's not just about learning itself too, right? It's about also thinking about let's say evacuation procedures in the workplace, especially given climate change. So we're seeing some of that play out in BC, right, with all the with some of the challenges that they're having in the region. And so I mean, it's an organization that's we're in 36 different countries. There's 90,000 people, so it can't just be one team that's thinking about this.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure it's complex and there's a lot of moving parts, especially when there's lots of competing priorities in a big organization.
Yeah.
And so you and I have had a lot of conversations about this, but I'm curious to know, based on your professional experience, as well as your you've done a lot of thought leadership on the future of work. I'm curious to know, what do you see as the most significant challenges that people living with disabilities might face in the future of work? And I'm not just thinking about like 5 years from now, I'm thinking like 10, 15 years down the road. What might be some of these specific challenges that you think people should be really aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few key pieces, right? The first continues to be that we need more data, and we need more actionable and sort of smart data that's much more specific. So when I say that, I mean, even like, for example, when I think about disability, like even within disability, there's a very big experiential difference if you're born with a disability, like if it's congenital, or if you've acquired it along the way. That experience can be quite different. And so I think we need to just get like a little sharper with those insights. And more than that, I think we actually have the data. It's more about actually having it curated, right? So it's about having smart people like yourself and those on the call make some of those connections for us, right? So like in an organization, like most folks are just so busy just keeping things running, right? Just keeping things running, that sometimes we don't have time to like really sit down and think about, okay, where can we actually apply it? And so we need folks to kind of connect the dots to say, okay, actually this could apply here. And are you thinking about it in this way? This insight will help you design this. And so I think even just keeping a design lens when we go out and collect data can really help in terms of actually being able to apply that data. Yeah.
Great. And so on this call, or on this in this conference, there's a wide diversity of people with lived experience, community partners, policymakers at different levels of government, employers. And I guess oftentimes there's like this perceived challenge of individuals not feeling like they have an opportunity to translate some of these experiences, both like through research or through lived experience, and get it into the hands of people in industry. What tips would you give to different stakeholders in ways that they can inform corporate practices? And so you don't have to talk specifically about your corporation, but maybe just more generally.
Look, I'm going to say something a little tongue in cheek. I talk to us like we're like 8, right? Small, clear sentences, just simple, like easy to read. 1 page is probably great. So just, and that's challenging too, right? So I think just as simple as you can make it is probably easier. Sometimes bright colors also help, like anything that catches attention, right? It's stuff. I don't think it has to be. I think it's just more about making it simpler and sort of speaking the same language. So sometimes, you know, it's about being able to translate. I've learned a lot of change can be ushered along faster if we just learn to speak the language of the audience that we're speaking to. So if there's certain jargon, like let's go jargon, right? Like that, whatever makes it a little easier to digest and to get to, if that helps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And so kind of related to this, as part of this conference, there's this development of the Pan-Canadian strategy on disability and work in Canada. And one of the core concepts is creating disability confidence amongst employers. And so a question I have for you is how, or what suggestions do you have for employers who are aiming to adapt to the future of work, but also trying to create this like level of disability confidence so that they're able to make their workplaces more inclusive? What suggestions would you have for someone who has these competing priorities?
I would actually take us, back a little bit and talk about I think a more structural challenge, and it ties back to what you're saying. I promise. I think that there's so many sort of I think the best way I can just explain it is if you imagine Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's a very simplistic pyramid, right? Like it's I understand that framework also is problematic on its own, but it's such a simple way of thinking about it. Like at the very bottom of the pyramid, you have basic needs, right? Physiological needs. We're talking housing, we're talking food, water, shelter, that kind of stuff. And if you think about just each of those things is like a system on its own in our society, right? And in each of those systems, you have significant accessibility challenges alone, right? Housing alone, housing just in the GTA is not great. But then you get into accessible housing and then it becomes another thing, right? Altogether. So all of those things, there are systemic barriers just within each of those systems. And then when all of the sometimes when they all kind of come together, they create this like super cyclone of challenges, right? And so with that, what ends up happening is that when you go to work, everything shows up with you. You can't forget these things. And so the challenges that you're speaking about from the employer side of things it's a lot, because you're not, when the person shows up to work, so does everything else. The whole person shows up to work. And so sometimes employers are having to have conversations that they're just not equipped to have, right? So like having to navigate sometimes social systems that they've just never had to do that before. And so when we talk about disability inclusion in the workplace, I'll give you a perfect example. Actually, when I started work, this was my very first job, so it was a transition all on its own. And when I started work, I remember having to take like a paratransit to get to work, because I thought that was the only way I could get to work. And I work downtown Toronto, and I live in sort of east end of the city, of the GTA. And it was taking me about 2.5 hours to get to work, and another 2.5 hours to get home. Within 3 months, I was ready to quit. I was like, that's it. I cannot work. I can't do this. Because I was exhausted. I was leaving to get to work for 9. I was leaving at like 7 something, and still feeling like I'm going to be late. And it took, it was my boss that went with me on the GO train to be like, did you know you can take this? I'm like, no. How would I even navigate Union Station? And so and that's and she did that when I handed her the resignation letter. She's like, no, don't, why are you doing this? And I'm like, because you're doing great and everything. So I explained to her that it was like, I'm like, this transportation, I can't do this. It's taking far too long. And so it's stuff like that bosses are getting into, that they don't really know how to deal with some of those conversations, and neither should they, in all fairness.
So that's an interesting point, and it sounds like you had a really proactive manager, which is really great. And I guess one thing that I'm wondering, and it's a theme that's popped up in a lot of our research, which is this transition for some occupations to move to a virtual environment, right? Virtual reality, utilizing work from home platforms. So in this world where we're now reliant on these technologies to perform our everyday tasks, in what ways could they create opportunities for people living with disabilities? But what are also some of the pitfalls? Like, what should we be aware of? What might be some of the challenges that employers as well as people with disabilities might face when transitioning to this virtual work environment?
So I've been very fortunate, because I've always had this hybrid sort of work opportunity. Like I used to be able to work from home even before. So when we fully transitioned to virtual, I was like, yeah, I can do this. I know how to do this. And can I tell you, I absolutely hit a wall. When we transitioned to virtual, I absolutely hit a wall. So, and I'll explain why. So one, what's great is like, yes, I think it's the flexibility, which I think a lot of people appreciate. And I think there's a lot of good things that come with that. Like, I think there's flexibility, there's ability to have what you need to be in, in your home in comfort and in an environment that you know how to navigate very easily without needing any sort of additional accommodations and things like that. So it takes away a lot of that. But I want to talk about the challenges a little bit too, because I absolutely hit a wall. So I was I transitioned to a new role. My manager didn't meet me in person, didn't know, and I lost it. I was like, because I in a regular I think what's interesting is like I use a wheelchair, so in real life, like people know my disability is disclosed whether I disclose myself or not. It's right there, right in the open, and sometimes that's easier, right? Because I don't have to bring it up. It's already out in the open. And I realized when we went virtual, my wheelchair does not show. Like you can't see it right now, and so it was almost like I went into the disability closet, right? Like all of a sudden I had an invisible disability when I've always had a disability, like visible disability. And so it felt like I had to approach disclosure all over again. And even for someone with like 7 years of experience, I was like, I can't do this. Like I was just beside myself. I didn't know how to do it. And so it took a very kind gay man actually to tell me like, Aisha, you need to come out of the closet. Like come out of it. Like that's it. Disability closet, you need to get out of it. And so I was like, okay. And then, but also like, I don't owe anybody my truth, right? So sometimes it's like whenever you're ready. And so I find that it's challenging because in a virtual environment, sometimes visible disabilities can become invisible disabilities. And for folks who have grown up with like, or have become used to having a visible disability, it's a different set of skills again, right? It's adjusting to a different set of skills. So I think there's those opportunities, but I also think that now that we're not like, other than going to the gym or going grocery shopping and stuff like that, I have no reason to actually be out in the community. And a fear of mine is that like now, like I feel like, is there any reason for people, like we were pushing towards like physical accessibility of environments for a long time because we're like, no, people have to go to work. So you have to make work accessible, buildings accessible, stuff like that. And now I'm like, do they need to? Like, will I just be given the virtual option all the time? Even though I want to be in person, because there is something about being in person that's actually kind of great. But I was like, oh, I hope I don't just get given the option. Oh, it'll be better for you. It's easier, right? And I'm like, not really. I want to be in person.
It's a great set of questions that you're asking, and some maybe unanticipated consequences of a virtual work environment is, will the physical spaces be accessible? So before we open up to the audience, I just have one last question for you. Aisha, and this is kind of, let's think about it in an optimistic way. From your perspective, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for people living with disabilities in the future of work?
I think people with disabilities are already like, people talk about disruption as if it's like it's a huge change, right? Disruption is a huge change in an environment. And I think people with disabilities are naturally used to that. We've been there, we know already. Right? Like when I think about when I was first prescribed my wheelchair, that turned my life like completely it took my life in a very different direction. That was a disruption for me. I've done it. I'm used to it. And so I think that people with disabilities have some skill. I think skills is just built in, just from experience, from lived experience of being able to navigate change, of being able to adapt, being flexible. These are all skills of the future, right? Like whether we want to or not, these are the human skills are the skills of the future. And I think there are built-in skills that we can use as transferable ones.
That's a fantastic point, and one in which I think we've seen the research pop up a lot. You can't automate the emotional intelligence or the lived experience of a person, and these skills are truly valuable. And so hopefully those who are thinking about this concept of the future of work think about the types of skills that can be automated and those that can't. And oftentimes people from diverse backgrounds, they have these skills that are going to be in increasing demand. And I think that's a really important point to highlight. So with that being said, I'm going to invite Ali and Kay, feel free to turn on your cameras. There are some questions in the Q&A box. And Aisha, I think these questions, I think you're going to be able to really have more thoughts than we will. So I'm actually going to pose it to you first. So this question is, would making closed captioning and other assistive devices that are accessed using technology, should they be a right enshrined in the Canadian Constitution to improve things for people with disabilities? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't have the, from an opinion perspective, I think that I don't know if it's a right, but I certainly know that there's certainly I think they're becoming more common anyway. I think it's just the way that things are moving. I think if you think about some of the way technology has improved, like I remember I used to have to use like Dragon Naturally Speaking to do like speech to text, right? Now it's everywhere. Like it's literally everywhere. So I would hope that they become more and more available, more useful. And I know that from my own experience, what I would say is like sometimes when you kind of tell people to do something, people kind of don't want to, right? Because it's like a mandatory thing. But sometimes we can do a lot just even to advocate to get people sort of going and to get people to offer things and then let people naturally organically take that on. I don't know if you guys have more thoughts on that, but that's a tough.
Well, I guess the one point I would probably add to that is like ideally with the implementation of the Accessibility Canada Act, that federally regulated entities will be fully inclusive, and if they're utilizing technology which requires closed captioning and other assistive services, hopefully with the successful implementation of that act, they are going to be implemented and will be available like they are a right for people with disabilities. And so definitely a good point from the person who was asking the question. And one I think that needs to be thought of is the use of these technologies and their becoming the role in which they can become more commonplace in the work environment. So definitely an important point. So Aisha, there's another question for you. And so this person asks, they say that it's interesting to think about the switch from visible to invisible disability and your reaction in the virtual world. For workers who are permanently injured or made sick in the workplace, most are invisible, except if you lose a limb or other types of injuries like they note. And it's common to hear from someone that you don't look injured. So this person's interested in your thoughts about switching from visible to invisible.
Yeah, like I said, it was I never saw that coming, right? I thought, I know this. I know about disclosure. It's a tough one. And I think I will offer the same advice I was given. It is very tough to actually disclose a disability. It remains one of the toughest things you have to do. And I would hope that we get to a point where we're not in an environment where that matters, right? Like I hope that we get to a point in our society, the optimistic part of me wants us to be in a society where it should just be like that. Oh, okay, that's cool, nice. Like nothing. I hope that we get to a point where we don't have, like, it doesn't feel like coming out of the disability closet, right? Like it just feels like we get to a point where it's okay to it's just a fact of the way we work. It can be tough. I don't know if I can add much more to that, but I hope that you have the supports that you need to be able to have these conversations like I did with someone else before you get to a point. So I think it's about making sure those discussions never become easier, but I'm hoping that you get to a point where you have the support systems you need to be able to have the right mentoring, the right coaching, to be able to approach these conversations in a way that you feel comfortable. And again, I would say the same thing to you. Like, I don't think you owe anybody your truth. Like, so it's when you're ready.
Yeah, and it is interesting that with some of these technologies that over time, there's a chance that like no one's going to be interacting in a physical work environment. You could be working in a manufacturing setting, but being able to perform your tasks from your home, right? In a utopian future. And so in that world, I guess people are more empowered to not share their truth with someone if they don't want to. And I think it creates a whole suite of questions with regards to the decision to communicate and how you want to communicate and when you want to communicate. And it's neat to note that you had a colleague who really encouraged you to speak more, but something that I think not everyone has access to is supportive colleagues. And so it definitely creates new protections for certain individuals who don't want to talk more about their needs or their lived experience. So we do have 5 minutes, and I think there is one more question. And again, it goes to you, Aisha. I think people are really engaged with your experience and your expertise. So this person asks about the risk of being siloed to at-home virtual options. What do you think the biggest risk or pitfall facing people with disabilities is in regards to these future technologies? What might be some of the unanticipated consequences of working from home or relying on these types of technologies that you might see emerge? And again, Kay or Ali, if you have any thoughts, feel free to jump in based on your work.
I mean, I would say like that, like I said, right, I'm a person with a disability too, and that's a fear. Like I actually do fear that. But I don't think we need to. Like I will also say that I have to also challenge myself sometimes to say, like, I think what's important is it's about being able to articulate your needs. So if your needs are that I want to be in person, then you should say so, and you should advocate for that. And I think I've certainly done that for myself. I'm like, that hybrid is great, but I'd like to be in the office at least like once or twice a week, please. Like I need to get out. But I think it's about advocating for your needs, and I think that's how we and having the right coaching conversations. I think, especially if you are someone with a lived experience of disability, never be, or anyone actually, I don't think I think never be afraid of being the person to having those tough conversations with your manager. That's the only way that until we have those difficult conversations, things that we're not comfortable with, until that happens, those needs never come to the fore. So unless we articulate those needs, not a lot of people have a way of finding out, right? So that's how I would say it.
And I think it's also important to preference, Aisha, that like your work situation is one that's stable in a pretty big corporation that has a lot of support available to you. But I think another point, and maybe the contrast to that, is the emergence of digital technologies can also mean that people are working more precariously and are forced into more like gig types of jobs where that opportunity to talk about your disability in a comfortable setting might not exist whatsoever, and it could mean that not getting the gig or not getting the contract, and that creates a whole set of challenges as well.
Well, I think the other challenges, even in like a legislative sense, right, is we don't have some of the precarious work covered in the standards. Like if I think about the AODA employment standards, I was a part of that committee, and I remember we ended up not including gig work as part of it. And so I think we need some again foresight into thinking about these issues ahead of time before they become a challenge.
Great. Thank you so much for that insightful comment. So we are nearing the end of our session. So I just wanted to thank our panelists, Kay, Ali, and Aisha, for taking the time to present and to discuss their experiences. It's been really valuable. And we also want to thank everyone in this session for participating and attending. We wanted to, again, just invite all conference participants to return again tomorrow. There's a whole suite of new sessions that will be launched tomorrow. And so definitely take a look at the website to decide which ones you'll attend. We also want to encourage participants to visit the conference hall, where they can watch the short pre-recorded presentations, as well as visit exhibitor booths. So again, we want to thank everyone, and we wanted to just wish you all a good night, and we look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's session.